It was an ordinary
7
Tuesday
days.
morning when I found the envelope tucked into
2
our front door.
days.
At first glance,
Eerlijk,
it looked like one of those
simpel.
community flyers or maintenance reminders the HOA occasionally sends out. I didn't think much of it. But as I opened it and started reading, a strange feeling crept in, disbelief, followed quickly by confusion. It was a formal notice of violation from our homeowners association, citing us for a supposed infraction. According to the letter, we were being fined for the unauthorized display of a flag on our property. The wording was sharp, almost accusatory, and it stated that we were in violation of Article 6, Section C, something about non-standard exterior displays. I read it twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of it. We weren't flying anything offensive or political. It wasn't even oversized or tattered. The flag had been up for weeks, and no one had said a word until now. It was mounted properly on a pole attached to our porch column, just like countless others in the neighborhood. So what exactly was the issue? I held the letter in my hands and looked out through the front window, staring at the flag waving gently in the breeze. It had deep, rich colors and a symbol at the center that meant something deeply personal to our family. To us, this wasn't just fabric on a pole, it was a reminder of where we came from, what we believed in, and the history that shaped us. Seeing it called out as some sort of problem felt like an attack on that identity, like our story didn't belong. The wording of the violation notice struck a nerve. It said the flag was non-compliant and inappropriate for public display in accordance with community standards. But nowhere in the HOA guidelines we'd read when moving in did it specify which flags were allowed and which were not. The rules spoke vaguely about decorations being in good taste and consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic, but those terms were subjective, left wide open to interpretation. And clearly, someone in the HOA had decided that our flag crossed a line. I wondered who reported it. Was it a single neighbor who had taken offense or simply misunderstood what they were seeing? Or was this the result of an HOA board member driving through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, checking for infractions like overgrown lawns or trash bins left out too long? The letter didn't say. There was no name attached, no contact person, just a general number to call and a warning that non-compliance would result in daily fines of $50. My partner was just as confused when I showed them the letter. What are they even talking about? They asked, eyes scanning the notice. We've seen people fly sports flags, garden flags, even full patriotic displays during the holidays. Why would ours be any different? That question hung in the air. Why ours? The more we talked about it, the more questions we had. Why now? Why this flag? And most importantly, who got to decide what was appropriate in a neighborhood filled with such a variety of people, backgrounds, and beliefs? It felt personal, even if it wasn't meant to be. But one thing was clear, we weren't going to just take the flag down quietly. Not without understanding what had triggered this response. I walked outside and stood beneath the flag, letting the letter dangle in my hand as I looked up at it. To me, it looked exactly how it always had, peaceful, proud, meaningful. And yet, somehow, to someone else, it had become a violation. The language in the HOA notice wasn't just firm, it was loaded. The words, inappropriate, and non-compliant, jumped off the page like accusations. It didn't feel like a routine rule enforcement, it felt like a judgment. According to the letter, our flag did not meet the standards outlined in the HOA's approved exterior decor policy, and therefore must be removed immediately to avoid escalating penalties. The phrasing was designed to leave no room for negotiation. They didn't ask us to explain or offer clarification. They told us to take it down, end of story. Reading those words, I felt something shift in me. I'd always understood that HOAs were strict, but this felt excessive. What exactly made our flag inappropriate? There was no profanity on it. It wasn't offensive or provocative. It wasn't even political in any obvious way. There were no slogans, no messages, no partisan logos, just a meaningful symbol surrounded by carefully chosen colors. We had made sure to mount it properly, not drape it across anything, and it wasn't obstructing any views or violating any safety codes. If anything, it added a bit of character to the front of our home. But someone clearly disagreed. And whoever drafted that notice saw the flag as a violation, not just of a rule, but of some unwritten expectation about what was acceptable in the neighborhood. It made me think about what kind of community we were really living in. Was it one that welcomed personal expression? Or one that enforced uniformity at the expense of individuality? I started replaying every walk I'd taken through the neighborhood, trying to remember what other flags I'd seen. There were sports flags, seasonal banners, military insignias, and plenty of American flags. Some were much larger than ours. Some were weather-beaten. None of them, as far as I knew, had been called out. I couldn't help but wonder, was our flag being singled out for what it looked like, or what someone assumed it meant? The thought sat heavy in my chest. We had chosen that flag for deeply personal reasons, tied to our family's roots and values. It wasn't a random decoration we bought at a store. It had history behind it, real meaning. And now, it was being lumped into the category of non-compliant, without anyone even asking what it stood for. The notice gave us 72 hours to remove the flag before daily fines would be imposed. It listed the exact amount, $50 per day, and emphasized that further violations could result in a formal hearing with the board. It even mentioned potential legal action if we refused to comply. That last part felt like a threat. It seemed absurd that something as seemingly harmless as a flag could escalate to the level of legal trouble, but that's how seriously the HOA treated it. I wanted to get answers, but the notice didn't provide any explanation or context, just citations from the rulebook and a generic email for the compliance committee. I sent an email right away, asking for more information. I kept my tone polite but firm. I asked which rule specifically our flag was breaking and whether there was a list of approved and unapproved flags. I also asked if there had been a complaint or if this was an independent decision by the board. As I hit send, I already knew it might take days to hear back, if at all. My mind started spinning with possible explanations. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone thought the flag represented something controversial. Or maybe they just didn't recognize it and assumed the worst. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being judged based on appearance alone, not intent, not context. Just a snap decision made by someone who never asked a single question. After reading and rereading the HOA's violation notice, confusion gave way to something more personal, frustration. We weren't just upset that we had been accused of breaking a rule. We were upset that no one had asked a single question before making that judgment. No call, no knock at the door, no email. Just a piece of paper shoved into our doorframe, telling us what we had done wrong and warning us of financial consequences if we didn't fix it immediately. The whole thing felt cold, one-sided, and disconnected from the kind of neighborly community we thought we lived in. We sat at the kitchen table, the letter lying flat between us, and tried to process it. My partner kept shaking their head. "I just don't get it," they said more than once. Neither of us could figure out what made our flag such a problem. It wasn't political, it wasn't vulgar, and it definitely wasn't some fringe symbol. We had seen worse on bumper stickers in the parking lot at the community center. It felt like our flag had been misunderstood or misinterpreted, and yet instead of someone simply asking us about it, we got hit with formal language and threats of daily fines. As parents, we also had to think about how to explain this to our kids. They'd helped choose the flag. We'd talked to them about its history and what it meant to our family. It was something that made them proud. Now we had to somehow tell them that someone, an authority figure in our neighborhood, had decided it wasn't okay. That it had to be taken down. Our youngest asked, "Are we in trouble?" That simple question cut deeper than anything in the letter. It made this abstract situation real and personal. The thing that stung the most was the lack of communication. We had lived in the neighborhood for a few years now. We paid our dues. We went to community events. We said hi to people on walks. We weren't outsiders or troublemakers. We tried to follow the rules, even the silly ones. And yet, in this situation, we had been treated like strangers, like we were somehow trying to push boundaries or cause conflict. It didn't make sense, and it didn't feel fair. We talked about what to do next. Should we take the flag down and fight it later? Should we leave it up and risk the fines while we waited for answers? Should we call around and try to talk to other board members individually, off the record? Every option felt like a compromise we didn't want to make. We weren't being rebellious for the sake of it. We just didn't think we'd done anything wrong. All we wanted was a chance to explain ourselves, or at the very least, for someone to ask. That evening, we decided to take a slow walk through the neighborhood and really look at what others were displaying. We saw multiple flags, sports teams, military service, some with animals or abstract designs. None of them looked standard. Some of them looked worn out. And yet, they were all still flying. Not a single one had a notice taped to the front door. That only deepened the frustration. What made ours different? Was it the design? The colors? The symbol? Or was it just that someone didn't understand it and assumed the worst? We started wondering about the process. Who decides what's acceptable and what's not? Is it a single person? A group? Is there a vote? Do they research the things they regulate, or do they go with gut reactions and assumptions? If someone on the board didn't recognize our flag, did they take 30 seconds to look it up? Or did they go straight to enforcement mode without even trying to learn? The more we thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a flag. It was about how quick people can be to judge what they don't understand. We knew we couldn't let this go without at least trying to set the record straight. The flag they were calling non-compliant wasn't just some random decorative piece we'd hung up for fun. It was tied to something real, something deeply rooted in our family's identity and history. We had chosen that flag carefully and intentionally. Every color, every symbol on it had meaning. It represented our heritage, our values, and the legacy of generations that came before us. So being told it was inappropriate, without any understanding of its significance, didn't sit right with us. We decided it was time to speak up. The first thing we did was gather documentation. We found a detailed explanation of the flag's origin, its symbolism, and its cultural relevance. We printed out articles, historical references, and even a page from a respected organization that explained its meaning. We wanted to be prepared, to offer a clear and calm response. We weren't going to respond with anger, we wanted to respond with facts. Our goal wasn't to fight the HOA, it was to educate them. To give them context for something they clearly didn't recognize or understand. I wrote an email to the compliance officer listed on the violation notice. I explained who we were, how long we'd lived in the community, and why we had chosen the flag. I attached the documents and offered to meet in person if that would help. I wrote it carefully, respectfully, but directly. I didn't demand an apology, and I didn't lash out. I just asked them to take another look, not just at the rule they thought we had broken, but at the assumptions that led them to think we'd broken it in the first place. We didn't hear back right away. But in the meantime, we decided to talk to a few of our neighbors, people we trusted, who knew us and had seen the flag. One of them, a retired teacher, was shocked. She'd always thought the flag looked beautiful, and she had never considered it controversial. Another neighbor, who had grown up in a different part of the country, admitted he hadn't known what the flag meant but had assumed it was something cultural. "I figured it had a story," he said. That comment stuck with me. If people are willing to assume there's a story behind something, they're usually willing to hear it. A few days later, we finally got a response from the HOA. The tone of the email was more formal than friendly, but it acknowledged receipt of our message and said the matter would be reviewed at the next board meeting. They didn't make any promises, but at least they were looking into it. That gave us a small bit of hope. We prepared a short presentation just in case. Nothing elaborate, just a concise explanation with visuals showing the flag's history, what the symbols meant, and why it was important to us. We also included examples of where the flag had been officially recognized and displayed, including by educational institutions and historical societies. Our goal wasn't to challenge the rules themselves, it was to show that the flag did not violate the spirit of those rules. It was neither offensive nor disruptive. It simply wasn't recognized, and that lack of recognition had led to an assumption that it didn't belong. While waiting for the board's decision, I also began to think about how often this probably happens, how often people see something they don't understand and immediately assume it must be a problem. The idea that unfamiliar means unacceptable isn't new, but it's always disheartening when it hits close to home. We didn't want to be combative or dramatic. We just wanted the board to pause for a moment, ask a question, and see the story behind what they thought was a violation. As we waited for the HOA board to respond, something unexpected began to happen. Neighbors started noticing. Some asked us directly about the letter we'd received, while others mentioned they had seen the flag and were surprised it had caused a problem. One neighbor stopped by while I was watering the front plants and said, "Hey, I heard something about a flag issue, what's going on?" That simple question opened the door to conversations we hadn't anticipated. People weren't just curious, they were genuinely interested in learning more. We began to explain the history of the flag to those who asked. We shared its cultural significance, its symbols, and why we chose to fly it. As we did, we saw a noticeable shift in people's reactions. One neighbor, who had assumed it was a decorative flag from a vacation spot, was stunned to learn its deeper meaning. Another neighbor, who'd driven by it dozens of times without giving it much thought, told us she felt embarrassed for not realizing it was more than just a design. It was a reminder of how easy it is to make assumptions based on appearance alone. Word spread quickly. A few people asked if they could read the materials we had sent to the HOA. Some even offered to speak up on our behalf if it came to that. These weren't just friends, they were people we waved to on walks, exchanged holiday cards with, or chatted with in passing. They had no obligation to get involved, but they wanted to understand. That made all the difference. In a neighborhood where flags of all kinds waved freely, sports teams, seasonal designs, military service banners, our situation made others take a closer look at what was being accepted without question and what was being challenged. It opened up discussions about fairness and consistency, about how enforcement shouldn't be based on what looks familiar or what someone personally agrees with. A few neighbors even admitted they didn't know what the HOA rules actually said about flags, and they went to check for themselves. Those conversations created a kind of ripple effect. One neighbor told us she planned to attend the next HOA board meeting for the first time, just to see how decisions like this were made. Another offered to look into the HOA's charter and bylaws to see if there were any vague or outdated policies that might be worth challenging. It became clear that this wasn't just about our flag anymore, it was about how the community handled diversity, expression, and communication. Our kids noticed the shift too. Instead of asking if we were still in trouble, they saw people stopping by with smiles and questions. They heard us talking calmly and confidently about our culture. It turned into an unexpected teachable moment, not just for our family, but for others around us. One family down the street asked if their kids could do a school project on the flag and its history, and we gladly helped them find resources. These weren't the reactions we expected when we first opened that notice. At the time, it felt like we were being singled out. But as it turned out, our neighbors were more open-minded and curious than we gave them credit for. The flag that had triggered a violation letter had now become a starting point for dialogue, empathy, and awareness. It had made people stop and think, and not just about one flag, but about the assumptions we all make, and the stories we don't always see on the surface. The HOA board still hadn't made its final decision, but something had already shifted in the neighborhood. The flag was still flying, and now it carried not just our story, but a growing understanding among the people who lived around us. About a week after we submitted our explanation and documentation to the HOA, we received an email that simply said the matter had been reviewed and resolved. At first, we weren't even sure what that meant. There was no detailed explanation, no direct apology, just a notice that the violation had been cleared and no fines would be issued. It was abrupt, almost clinical. But the implication was clear enough: the HOA had realized their mistake. The flag was no longer considered inappropriate or non-compliant. Just like that, the threat was lifted. Later that day, we received a follow-up letter in the mail, this time printed on official HOA letterhead and signed by the board president. It was more formal in tone, but it included a sentence that stood out. They acknowledged that the flag had been initially misidentified, and that, upon further review, it does not violate any current HOA exterior display guidelines. It was the closest thing we were going to get to an admission that they had acted too quickly, and without full understanding. There was still no direct apology, no reflection on how the situation had been handled, but it was enough to feel like a small victory. When we told our neighbors, many of them were genuinely relieved. Some had followed the situation closely, asking for updates every time they saw us outside. Others simply offered congratulations or said how glad they were that the HOA had come to its senses. A few even asked if they could display similar flags now that they knew the story behind it. What started as a dispute had become a shared conversation, and now, it was shifting into something bigger, a moment of change in how people thought about rules, assumptions, and the importance of context. But what stood out more than anything was how differently things might have gone if we hadn't pushed back. If we had simply taken the flag down without explanation, the HOA would have gone on thinking it was right to label something unfamiliar as inappropriate. It made us realize how often people probably do that, quietly comply, even when something feels unfair or wrong, just to avoid confrontation. That's what the system often counts on. Silence. Compliance. Giving up. In this case, a little patience, some research, and a willingness to speak up changed the entire outcome. It wasn't about being defiant or dramatic. It was about telling the truth of something that mattered to us, and trusting that when people were given the full story, they might actually listen. It made us think about how many other things go unchallenged in communities like ours simply because people feel like they don't have a voice or they won't be heard. Even after the issue was resolved, we continued to have conversations with people in the neighborhood. Some thanked us for bringing attention to how vague and subjective the HOA rules were. Others told us they'd started looking into their own flags and decorations, wondering what might be allowed and what might get them into trouble. One neighbor even joked that the HOA might need a crash course in cultural literacy. It was said half seriously, but there was truth in it. The entire situation highlighted a real gap, not just in knowledge, but in communication and empathy. Eventually, we noticed that the HOA updated their website with a short note clarifying that flags would now be reviewed on a case-by-case basis and that cultural or historical flags would be given consideration in context. It wasn't a sweeping policy change, but it was a start. It meant they were thinking differently. Maybe even learning. The flag still hangs from our porch, right where it was before all this started. But now, when people walk by and look at it, some of them stop and ask questions. They want to know the story behind it. They want to learn what it represents. And they see it not as a violation, but as something worth understanding.